Viserys Targaryen here, and I just wanted you to know, Christmas is coming.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about Coldhands and Benjen. Again, originally I had thought about just separating these two. That's kind of how I had it to begin with. But there's a lot of things I want to get to in this event, and so kind of smushing these two together just made the most amount of sense. They're very connected. They talk about kind of the same plot lines. And so we're going to talk about it, right? We're going to talk about where Benjen's journey went wrong. Where is he? Maybe where he's going to pop back up into the story, and why he's been gone for so long. Maybe some of the reasoning as to why George had to make sure Benjen was out of the story for the most part. And also, we're going to talk about Coldhands and who he could possibly be and what his importance actually could be as well. So let's get into it. Let's start off with Benjen. Now, Benjen, looking at his journey, I made sure, and I went back through all the different PDFs that you can find for the book series online. And all I did was I searched for Benjen's name. I went through every single listing of Benjen's name in the story to try and put together all of the evidence, to try and figure out what exactly happened on this journey. And I'm going to be having a map up quite a lot during this because I think it's important to understand where Benjen is and where he kind of goes missing at in this general area. So let's look at the first pieces of evidence and to establish where Benjen was going. This quote comes from A Game of Thrones with Jon's POVs, but 3 days after their arrival, Jon had heard that Benjen Stark was to lead a half-dozen men on ranging into the haunted forest. So again, pretty standard, right? If you're going to go outside of Castle Black and go north of the wall, you're probably going to start in the haunted forest, again, directly north of Castle Black. But this is, again, to figure out what ended up happening to our party at the prologue of A Game of Thrones, what all happened to them, and as well as this is really important given that one of them is a Royce, very important family, and you'd want to curry favor, figure out what ended up happening. Also, it's very mysterious that, and again, in Gior's own words, two of his best rangers were sent with him, with Royce. One of them goes missing, and the other deserts. So, really interesting, and again, I think you want to figure out why that is. So let's go to another quote that we see in A Game of Thrones from Jon's POV. The old bear had sent out rangers in search of him. Sir Jeremy Riker had led two sweeps, and Corin Halfhand had gone forth from the Shadow Tower, but they'd found nothing aside from a few blazes in the trees that his uncle had left to mark his way. In the stony highlands to the northwest, the marks stopped abruptly, and all trace of Benjen Stark vanished. Now, let's also think about some other things just to kind of show what Benjen's pathing might have been. So we're going to have another quote as well here from A Clash of Kings with Jon when they get to Craster's Keep. I have not seen Benjen Stark for 3 years, and if truth be told, I never once missed him. So let's look at the map I'm going to have up on the screen right now. If we can mark where this journey starts. So again, starts at Castle Black, and he starts making for the east in the haunted forest, going up to that area. Now, if we take Craster's word for truth, which again is kind of debatable, Craster might have reason to lie, given that maybe he gave Benjen bad information to maybe even help him go the wrong area to then die. Maybe he feels some sort of guilt there, just doesn't want to be known associating with Benjen for any of that suspicion that would go on to him. So let's take it at face value and say that Craster isn't lying and that he hasn't seen Benjen. So logically, where I think Benjen would have gone is he would have gone up to the haunted forest, and then given that we know where he disappears, in the northwest stony highlands, and I never found any confirmation of this. I looked on the wiki, I looked just on the Reddit trying to figure out where exactly this is. Based on my interpretation, this is this mountainous area to like the west and the north of the Shadow Tower. That's what I'm given to believe that is. And given also his journey, right? Because I think if he doesn't go to Craster's Keep, he would have gone to the north of Craster's Keep, coming in on the east side of the Fist of the First Men. From there, I think this is either... So there's two options here. Either one, this is when he puts down the cache that Jon finds. If that is his, this is what it would be. So let's do that quote as well as we're talking about Jon, as we're talking about Benjen's whereabouts, and this kind of confirms that he was here if this was Benjen's cache that was left. It was growing harder to cling to the hope of Benjen Stark's safe return. The cloak he had found beneath the fist could well have belonged to his uncle or one of his men. Even the old bear admitted as much, though why they would have buried it there, wrapped around the cache of dragonglass, no one could say. So again, I think there's a couple of thought processes here. So one, this could have been Benjen just leaving this here, realizing the threat. Maybe they'd already been attacked by the others, or maybe Benjen had already felt the feeling that they were being tracked. All of that is possible. Or the second idea is, so Benjen goes to the northwest in the Stony Highlands where we see these markings, and he gets attacked here. This is where most of his party gets attacked. Something like that ends up happening. Okay. So the remaining party members, or if it's just Benjen himself, goes back to the fist of the first men and hides that cache there, given that they know there's a threat of the others and they're trying to, gather dragonglass. So either way, I am led to believe that Benjen himself did not escape, much further than the east of the Fist of the First Men. Whether you believe he came back, whether you think he got attacked in the northwestern over here, kind of near the Frost Fangs, a little below that, either way, right? He didn't make it to kind of this eastern side of the Haunted Forest. Now, the better part, or the more interesting part would be, okay, these bodies that we end up seeing that were of Benjen's comrades, how did they get so far south if they got attacked all the way over here in the northwestern area or kind of by the Fist of the First Men? So I would tend to believe there's a couple rationales you could also go with here. That a few of his men either deserted him, right? So he was going further, pushing forward, and some of his men said, we're going to either desert, or maybe they told Benjen, we're going to go tell the wall what has happened. So they leave, and they maybe get to maybe close to Craster's Keep in the Haunted Forest area, and they end up dying. I think all of that is possible as well. So there's a lot we just don't know here, right? We know that Benjen basically goes missing in this boxed area I'm going to have, and that's the extent of Benjen. But then we also know we find a couple of his companions over here in this area, and then they reanimate as whites. So a lot to process here, because what happens to Benjen? And even if we look at possibly Benjen's death, we get this line that John kind of imagines Benjen lying dead in the snow. Again, now we know John is bitter because of not being able to go on this ranging, and he kind of feels lied to, manipulated because the wall is not what he thought it was. But is this possibly foreshadowing to what actually happened to Benjen? It's possible. Now, let's kind of look at this. So again, I think the most logical rationale, given the way all this breaks down, the way we haven't gotten any messages from Benjen, nobody has come back to the wall to report on his doings, or if he's alive, is he's dead. That's the first one. The first option is Benjen's just dead and he's gone. The second option is Benjen got captured. Now, there could be some interesting ideas here, like, well, the Starks could be tied in with the other's blood. That's possible. The Night's King could have had Stark blood as well. That's not confirmed, I don't believe. So that is possible. So then maybe the others were using Benjen, right? Maybe they were using him as a Stark. Maybe they recognized his blood, so they wanted him for that. The other possibility could have been, if John is this special character, this Azor Ahai or something like that, maybe they were trying to capture him and they got the wrong person, right? We know the Royces also have a bit of Stark blood in them as well, so maybe that's why Waymar Royce was assaulted in the first chapter as well. So there is some interesting ideas that maybe the reason Benjen straight up is not coming back to the wall is because he got captured by the others. We know that they at least got attacked. But the problem is, we don't know what happened to the ones that are missing. Are they just whites in the army, or have they been captured? It's said that he went with half a dozen men, but yet we've only seen 2. A lot of questions there. I also wanted to say, before we do move on to Coldhands, I wanted to mention why it makes so much sense that Benjen is not in the story. And even when I was doing my research for this video, when you search his actual name through each of the books, he slowly has less mentions, right? The first book, he has quite a lot. There's a lot of characters that are thinking about him, and then it very quickly just turns to, he's only got a very few mentions, and a lot of them actually aren't even relevant to actually this topic. So I thought that was important. And one reason I think that George had to do this with this character is that Benjen just knows too much information. Like, think about what he knows. Whether you believe Rhaegar and Lyanna, whether you believe Ned and Ashara, whether you believe any of these parentage stuff, it's very likely that Benjen knows a lot of information that George cannot have revealed. So it doesn't make sense for this character to be around. And whether that's George is going to be able to use Benjen as a character to reveal some of that information, whether that's through Bran, right? Maybe this is how Bran figures out Jon's parentage. We saw it happen differently in the show, but maybe that's what Benjen's use is going to be, right? And whether that, again, is how I talked about in this video, whether that's, again, he's a prisoner, whether that's he's just kind of wandering around gathering information, he just hasn't been able to make his way south, whatever you want to say, it makes the most amount of sense for George to keep Benjen out of it, because Benjen is very similar to Howland Reed. Is in Howland Reed has been left out of the story based upon the fact that he knows too much information, right? You can't give off all of your big reveals at the very beginning. So I just wanted to add that into here because I thought that was really relevant into the conversation as to why we still haven't seen Benjen like back since the book 1. And so that kind of leads us into the next part of this. And the next part of this is the third option being, is Benjen just Coldhands? Is Benjen serving the children of the forest in one way or the other? And that means he can't really get a message to the wall. Well, we know that's not really true because he interacts with Bran and their party coming north of the wall. And so why couldn't he just send a message to the wall? Doesn't really seem to make sense. He doesn't need to even go to the other side of the wall. Just go up to Castle Black and have somebody come down. And I've talked about this with Coldhands and the idea that Benjen is Coldhands. It doesn't really make any sense because there's just a lot of reasons to believe there isn't. George R. R. Martin, in a, I think, edited copy or some sort of notes, basically, he said Benjen is not Coldhands. Now, George could change his mind, but given that the character of Coldhands is already established and then that note comes out, it would seem George probably had something else for that character. Also, you look at the idea that the Children of the Forest describe Coldhands as being like this for a while. Like, he's been here for a while. Benjen would only have been Coldhands for like 2 years at most. 2.5 if it was instant. So that doesn't seem to make any sense either. So, given all of this information on Benjen, right, it doesn't really seem to make any sense. Like, yes, Coldhands seems to have a Night's Watch cloak. That doesn't really instantly imply Benjen. And again, I've already talked about the timeline doesn't seem to work with Benjen becoming Coldhands. So let's get a little bit of description about Coldhands, some quotes about him, and then let's try to piece together the likely options or possible candidates for the Coldhands character. So basically, this is our first introduction into Coldhands. It's Gilly and Sam recounting what happened with them and how Coldhands had saved them. But the description here is, but the quote comes from, again, as Bran is at the Night Fort trying to get north of the wall. He was, Jojen frowned, this Coldhands. That wasn't his true name, said Gilly, rocking. We only called him that, Sam and me. His hands were as cold as ice, but he saved us from the dead men, him and his ravens, and he brought us here on his elk. And even in Dance of the Dragons, we also get another description in one of Bran's opening chapters. Coldhands was the name that the fat boy Sam had given him. For though the ranger's face was pale, his hands were black and hard as iron, and cold as iron too. The rest of him was wrapped in layers of wool and boiled leather and ringmail, his features shadowed by his hooded cloak and a black woolen scarf about the lower half of his face. So again, let's just talk about these descriptions that we've gotten before we do any more quotes or we get any more information with this character. Some things I find very interesting. The first idea we have here is this character is very much almost described as a white. His hands are ice cold. He is not really human anymore. But also something interesting is the way that he's described as having ravens. Something that will kind of link to something else a little bit later on with the characters that could be responsible for being Coldhands. All interesting ideas, but we also get the idea that this is a character that was a man of the Night's Watch. Something else we'll have to kind of look at because that'll be interesting to really think about in the identity of this character. And just a little bit more foreshadowing to the idea of Coldhands with the ravens, there comes another quote in the same chapter. Coldhands stood beside the door, a raven on his arm, both staring at the fire, reflections from the flames glittering off 4 black eyes. He does not eat, Bran remembered, and he fears the flame. Again, just given very white-like symptoms, right? It seems like the others do not like the fire. That's what Jon uses to kill the others in the first book. So again, seems very white-like. Like this is a character that it seems like died, but he doesn't have the effects of all the others. Very interesting, but also this idea that he has a raven on his shoulder, almost as if this is a spy or this is some sort of communication that will link to even a character named after a raven in Bloodraven later on. Even when asked about the three-eyed crow, Coldhands responds quite curiously. A friend, dreamer, wizard, call him what you will, the last green seer. Again, I think it's interesting the way he says a friend, because given the way I'm going to go with this theory and the way I think the most logical idea that we have based on Coldhands' identity, friend is an interesting one to start with, given where I think this is going. And I think a lot of you also will probably understand where I'm going with this as well, but let's continue. And the last little bits of notes that we get about Coldhands and see his character is in the middle part or early parts of Dance with Dragons. So, again, a character that's very mysterious. We've gotten a little bit of notes about him from the Children of the Forest that I mentioned earlier in this video. So who do I think this character is? I think this character is probably unnamed. I don't think we've actually gotten his name yet, but I would happen to think that he is one of the archers or one of the men in the Raven's Teeth that went with Bloodraven north to the Wall. We know that this happened. Again, Aemon actually came up with Bloodraven when this happened. Bloodraven did this. Bloodraven was sent to the Wall, for those people that do not know, because of him killing a Blackfire when, he probably wasn't supposed to. He had offered peace and a parley and to allow this Blackfire to give a chance at this council to decide who would become king, and Bloodraven broke that, so Aegon V sent him to the Wall. So, that's who I think it is, given the implications that he considers. Again, the first thing that comes to mind on who the Three-Eyed Crow is, again, this is assuming that Bloodraven is kind of the Three-Eyed Crow, if you want to go with that theory. That's the first thing that he references is a friend. Let's also think about that this character seems like he's a servant, or he has some sort of companionship or friendship, or even just an ally with the Children of the Forest and also the Three-Eyed Crow and or Bloodraven. How did this character come back to life? It seems as though the Children of the Forest had something to do with it. And we also look at the idea that this character, again, has very deep ties to ravens, right? There's always a raven on his shoulder, and he gives me the vibe of a Raven's Teeth member. Some other people have thought maybe this is the Night King or the Night's King. It's possible. I think the most likely option, with all of the quotes, all the evidence I've provided in the second half of this video to kind of figure out who this character is I think it's just as simple as it's one of the members of the Raven's Teeth, the army that basically supported Bloodraven. I think that's the easiest answer and the clearest given the information we know. It fits all the categories, right? Even when you look at, okay, Coldhands has been Coldhands for quite a while. We don't know how much that is, but even with that, right, it would still be basically majority of Maester Aemon's lifetime that this character would be Coldhands. So I think all that adds up. This would be someone that was a part of the Night's Watch at some point. I think everything lines up. Why he would have ties to Bloodraven, all of that makes sense to me. But let me know if you guys think I'm wrong, or if I'm wrong about Benjen, or anything you guys want to talk about with this topic. And I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.